The storm had passed, but the coastline still bore its wrath. Waves crashed against jagged black rocks, sending white foam cascading over the beach, and the air smelled of salt, damp earth, and the lingering charge of lightning. Dr. Ethan Harrow had been walking this stretch of Thalassa's remote coastline for months, always at dawn, always alone. The planet was a forgotten outpost, a world of deep oceans and endless horizons, where he had been assigned to a lonely medical station after a fallout with the Galactic Union. But this morning was different. This morning he wasn't alone. Near the water's edge, half buried in the wet sand, lay a figure unlike anything he had ever seen. Ethan's breath caught as he approached, his boots sinking into the damp earth. She looked human, at first. Slender arms, delicate hands, long silver hair that clung to her skin like seaweed. But where her legs should have been, there was a long, iridescent tail, the scales flickering between hues of blue and silver. She wasn't breathing. Instinct took over. Ethan dropped to his knees, brushing wet strands of hair from her face, searching for any sign of life. He pressed 2 fingers to the delicate curve of her throat. A pulse. Weak. But there. "Come on, stay with me," he murmured, slipping into medic mode. He tilted her head, checking her airway. Her gills, God, she had gills, fluttered faintly, but they were clogged with sand and debris. She had been thrown ashore, left to die. And from the looks of it, everyone had abandoned her. Not on my watch. Ethan lifted her into his arms, her body colder than he expected, her skin soft yet strangely resilient. He ignored the unfamiliar sensation of her bioluminescent scales against his fingers and focused on one thing: getting her to safety. The medical station was a simple structure, carved into the side of a cliff overlooking the sea. It was meant for deep-sea researchers, but today it had become a sanctuary for the forgotten. Ethan carefully placed the alien woman on the diagnostic bed, adjusting the environmental controls to mimic the oxygen balance of Thalassa's deep waters. He hooked her up to an IV, introducing slow, steady hydration. Her body was dehydrated, battered, but not broken. As the monitors hummed to life, displaying readings he barely understood, Ethan ran a hand through his damp hair. "What the hell are you? A forgotten species? A refugee? A prisoner who had escaped?" Her body twitched. Ethan snapped to attention. Her chest rose in a shallow breath, then another. Her gills flared slightly, the blockage clearing. Then her eyes opened. Ethan felt himself freeze. They were like the ocean itself, an endless, shifting blue, almost too large for her delicate face, glowing faintly in the dim light of the medbay. For a moment, she just stared at him, confusion flickering across her features. Then, as if realizing her own existence all over again, her body jerked upright, only to collapse as a sharp gasp escaped her lips. "Hey, easy," Ethan said, catching her before she fell. "You're weak. You need rest." She blinked at him, her gaze darting to the machines, then to the IV in her arm. Finally, her eyes locked onto his face. "Human?" she whispered, her voice a fragile echo, like the wind over water. Ethan exhaled, nodding. "Yeah." She swallowed hard. Her throat worked as though she wanted to say more, but her body was too drained. Instead, her bioluminescent skin flickered faintly, the light dimming before stabilizing. She was alive, but she was alone. And something told Ethan that if he hadn't found her, no one else would have. "I don't know who you are," he said softly, "but you're safe now." The alien woman's glowing eyes flickered shut again, her body surrendering to exhausted sleep. Ethan sat beside her, running a tired hand down his face. What the hell have I just gotten myself into? Ethan sat beside the unconscious alien woman, his fingers drumming against the metal surface of the medical table. The quiet hum of medical monitors filled the air, their soft beeping indicating that, for now, she was stable. But his mind was anything but. He had seen a lot of strange things in his years as a combat medic, from battlefield surgeries on uncharted worlds to alien viruses that melted flesh like acid. But this, a mermaid-like woman washed up on the shores of a forgotten planet, was something else entirely. Ethan stood, stretching his tense muscles, and walked over to his workstation, where the scans of her biology were still running. The results made no damn sense. Her gills functioned as secondary respiratory systems, but they weren't entirely necessary. She also had lungs, perfectly adapted for atmospheric breathing. Her body had an energy-based circulatory system, glowing in pulses of bioluminescent blue. And then there was her nervous system, which was far more complex than a human's, hinting at a level of sensory perception Ethan couldn't even begin to understand. And yet, she wasn't registered in any galactic database. That troubled him more than anything. He tried running a deeper scan for genetic markers, cross-referencing with known aquatic species from across the Union, but the results came back inconclusive every time. "What the hell are you?" His gaze drifted back to her resting form. She looked peaceful now, but he had a feeling that wherever she had come from, she hadn't been safe. An hour later, the monitors beeped differently. Ethan turned sharply, watching as the woman stirred, her breathing growing stronger, her fingers twitching. Then she gasped. Her entire body convulsed, and for a moment her scales flared with an unnatural glow, the medical sensors flickering in response. She was waking up, and fast. Ethan rushed to her side. "Hey, take it easy, you're safe." Her eyes snapped open. For a moment there was only panic. Her glowing blue irises darted around the room, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She tried to sit up, but immediately winced, her hands gripping the sides of the bed. Her body wasn't ready yet. Ethan held up his hands in a calming gesture. "Breathe. You're okay. You're in a medical facility." Her gaze landed on him, sharp, intelligent, but guarded. "Human?" she whispered again, voice barely audible. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, and you are?" She hesitated like she was trying to remember. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "Mera." Her name rolled off her tongue like a wave retreating back into the ocean. Ethan exhaled. A start. "Well, Mera," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "you washed up on Thalassa's shore in pretty bad shape. I don't know how you got here, but you're safe now." She didn't answer at first. Instead, she reached for her throat, touching the delicate gills there before trailing her fingers down to her chest, like she was confirming that she was still alive. Then her gaze flicked to the IV line in her arm and her expression darkened. "You interfered," she said suddenly, her voice stronger this time. Ethan blinked. "Excuse me? You were not supposed to." A chill crawled down his spine at the weight of her words. What the hell did that mean? Ethan watched as Mera tried to sit up again, her muscles tensing against the movement. He placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Hey, slow down. You're still recovering." Mera glared at him, but relented, her body too weak to resist. She sank back into the bed, her bioluminescent markings pulsing faintly, a reaction he didn't quite understand yet. "You weren't supposed to save me," she said again, her voice quieter this time. Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" Mira's eyes drifted to the ceiling, her expression unreadable. "Acarions are not meant to be found," Ethan stilled. Acarions. That name didn't exist in any official galactic database. "You're saying you're an Acarion?" Ethan asked carefully. Mera closed her eyes for a moment, as if bracing herself before nodding. Ethan exhaled sharply. A new species. An undocumented, unregistered species. No wonder there was no record of her DNA. He had just discovered something the galaxy had ignored or erased. "Mera," Ethan said slowly, "if no one was supposed to find you, why were you here? What happened?" Mera hesitated, then turned her glowing gaze toward him. "I was left to die." Ethan's stomach twisted. She said it with such calm certainty that it chilled him to the core. "What?" Mera swallowed. "My kind are not wanted. Not by the Union, not by the colonies. We are seen as dangerous." Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Dangerous?" he repeated, incredulous. "You're a damn shipwreck survivor. What the hell is so dangerous about you?" Mera let out a soft, bitter laugh. "That is a question my people have been asking for centuries." Ethan clenched his jaw. He had seen this before. Entire species labeled as threats, entire planets reduced to exile, all because someone in power decided it was easier to erase them than understand them. And from the look in Mira's haunted eyes, he knew she had lived through that truth firsthand. Slowly, Ethan reached out, resting a careful hand over hers. "You're safe now," he said. Mira's breath hitched slightly, her fingers twitching beneath his. "For how long?" she whispered. Ethan's grip tightened, his voice turning resolute. "For as long as it takes." Mera didn't respond, but this time when she closed her eyes, she didn't look like she was waiting to die. Ethan sat back, his mind racing. If she had been abandoned, if her people were being hunted or erased, then her survival was more than just a medical miracle. It was a rebellion, and if the galaxy thought they could erase her, then they had another thing coming. Because Ethan Harrow had just made a choice, and he wasn't going to let Mera disappear. It wasn't just pain. It wasn't just survival. It was centuries of exile, of erasure, of knowing that her people had been cast away and forgotten. She had been left to die because somewhere, in the bureaucratic maze of the Galactic Union, someone had decided that Acarians didn't deserve to exist. And that made Ethan furious. As he adjusted her IV fluids, Mera's gaze followed him, her glowing blue eyes unreadable. "You're still watching me like you expect me to disappear?" Ethan said without looking up. Mera's voice was soft but steady. "Because that's how it always happens. Someone tries to help and then they realize the weight of it." Ethan finally turned to her. "The weight of what?" "Being associated with me," Mera whispered. "Being associated with my kind, it's a stain, an unspoken rule. Acarians do not belong in the galaxy." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had heard of species that were forced into obscurity by politics and power. Entire civilizations wiped from the galactic register, their history twisted or erased. But hearing it from someone who had lived through it was different. Mera was the living proof of a history the galaxy had tried to bury. "That's bullshit," Ethan said bluntly. Mera blinked, startled. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Ethan crossed his arms. "Someone decides that you're dangerous, not because of what you've done, but because it's convenient for them. And everyone just goes along with it? Just accepts it?" Mera let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You really don't know the galaxy, do you?" Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, leaning forward. "No, but I know what's right. And this isn't right." For a moment, Mera just stared at him. Her breathing slowed. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed faintly. Then she did something Ethan didn't expect. She smiled. It was small, fragile, barely there, but it was the first real expression of hope he had seen on her face. "You're different," Mera murmured. Ethan smirked. "You have no idea." The next morning, Mera was strong enough to move on her own. Ethan had rigged up a makeshift aquatic tank in the medical bay, using the lab's isolation chamber and modifying the temperature and oxygen levels to something closer to what her body needed. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than keeping her stranded on a dry medical table. Mera lowered herself into the water slowly, letting out a soft, almost musical sigh as the fluid surrounded her body. For the first time since she had washed ashore, she looked at ease. Ethan sat on a nearby stool, watching as she adjusted. "Better?" Mera nodded, stretching her arms before sinking slightly into the tank, her scales shimmering as she moved. "Much." Ethan leaned back, exhaling. "All right, time to answer some real questions." Mera's gaze flickered toward him warily. "I was wondering when that would happen," Ethan gestured. "First question, who the hell abandoned you?" Mera went silent. She drifted in the water for a moment, her expression unreadable. But then she slowly turned her glowing gaze toward him. "My own people." Ethan stiffened. He hadn't expected that. "What?" Mera exhaled, her fingers trailing along the surface of the water. "There's more than one way to disappear, Ethan. My people, we have always lived between worlds. The galaxy rejected us, but some of us still tried to survive." She looked down. "But surviving comes with rules, and I broke them." Ethan felt something twist in his gut. "What kind of rules?" Mera hesitated, then whispered, "I fell in love with someone outside my kind." The words hit Ethan like a cold wind. "That's it?" he asked, incredulous. "That's all it took for them to cast you out?" Mera let out a bitter laugh. "You don't understand. To them, it was the ultimate betrayal. Acarians were always meant to remain hidden, separate. The moment I let myself believe in something else, I became tainted." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, anger bubbling under his skin. "So they just left you to die?" Mera's fingers curled into a fist beneath the water. "They left me to be found, but no one was supposed to save me." Ethan inhaled sharply. Everything clicked into place, her body washing ashore. The fact that no distress signal had been sent. The way she had spoken about being forgotten, they had discarded her. Not because she had committed some great crime, but because she had dared to believe she could belong. Something inside Ethan snapped. He had spent his whole life watching powerful people decide who deserved to live and who didn't, watching soldiers become numbers and refugees become statistics. Watching people turn their backs on what was right because it was easier. Not this time. He looked at Mera, his voice quiet but unshakable. "They were wrong." Mera's breath hitched. Ethan stood, stepping closer to the tank. "I don't care what they told you. I don't care what the galaxy thinks it knows. You deserve to be here, and I'm not going to let them erase you. For the first time, Mera's mask cracked. Her lip trembled slightly. Her fingers tightened against the glass. And then she spoke the words that would change everything. Then you're the first. Ethan's chest tightened, because he realized at that moment that he was the only one in the galaxy who had ever told her that, and he wasn't going to be the last. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mera allowed herself to hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. Ethan's words still echoed in her mind. You deserve to be here, and I'm not going to let them erase you. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever meant it. She floated in the makeshift tank, letting the water cradle her as she tried to process everything. Ethan was different. He wasn't like the Union enforcers who had looked the other way, nor was he like the Acarion elders who had cast her aside to preserve their secrecy. He had saved her when he didn't have to. He had stood beside her when everyone else had abandoned her. She had spent her life believing that she was a mistake the universe wanted to forget. Now, for the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong. But that fragile hope didn't last long, because the storm was already coming. Ethan had always trusted his instincts, and right now, they were screaming. Something was off. He sat at his workstation, scrolling through planetary logs, checking Union patrol frequencies. The remote medical station on Thalassa had been quiet for months, too quiet. This planet was meant to be isolated, a forgotten outpost where he had been sent after breaking too many rules. But suddenly, there was activity. He didn't believe in coincidences. A flickering alert appeared on his screen. A Union patrol vessel had entered the system. His stomach clenched. They knew, or at the very least, they suspected something. His mind raced. How? No distress calls had been sent. No one should have even known Mera existed. Unless, his pulse quickened. Had she been left here on purpose? Was this a trap? Ethan turned toward the tank, watching Mera float in the water, her bioluminescent skin pulsing faintly as she rested. She had no idea what was coming for her, and neither did he. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let them take her. Ethan didn't sleep. He spent the next few hours preparing. If the Union was coming, he needed to be ready. He modified the station's security protocols, rerouted outgoing communications, and disabled the main docking platform. Anything that would slow them down if they tried to take Mera by force. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. Because the Union didn't stop. They didn't negotiate. If they had decided Mera was a problem, they wouldn't hesitate to make her disappear. And Ethan? He wasn't going to let that happen. Mera woke to the sound of alarms. Her glowing eyes snapped open, panic flooding her system as the water around her vibrated with the energy of the approaching storm. She turned to see Ethan already in motion, his movements quick and calculated. His expression was grim. "We don't have time," he said. "The Union is here." Her blood ran cold. No, not yet. Not now. She pulled herself up, ignoring the dull ache in her muscles. How? How did they find me? Ethan shook his head. I don't know, but I do know that if we stay here, they'll take you, and I won't let that happen. Mera stared at him. He meant it. He was willing to fight for her. Something inside her shifted. She had spent her life running, hiding, surviving. But now, she wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't just a secret to be buried. She was alive, and she was done being erased. Mera straightened, her bioluminescent markings flaring brighter than ever before. Then let's make sure they never find me again. Ethan smiled grimly. That's the plan. He tossed her a breathing apparatus, a modified oxygen mask designed to work with her dual respiratory system. We're getting off this rock, he said, together. Mera took it without hesitation. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just being rescued. She was fighting for her own future. And she wasn't going to lose. The Union patrol ship descended through Thalassa's storm-laden skies, its sleek metallic hull slicing through the thick clouds like a blade. Red navigational lights pulsed ominously against the dark backdrop of the ocean. They had come for her. Inside the medical station, Ethan and Mera moved quickly. The base's security alarms blared through the halls, warning of an unauthorized landing. Ethan had locked down the primary entrance, but it wouldn't hold. Not against military-grade override systems. Mera's bioluminescent markings pulsed with tension as she tightened the straps of the breathing apparatus Ethan had given her. They won't stop, she said. Ethan finished packing a portable medical kit into his duffel bag, slinging it over his shoulder. His pulse was steady, but inside he was burning with fury. Then neither will we. He turned to the small, hidden transport hatch that led directly to the ocean. It was an emergency evacuation tunnel, normally used for deep-sea research teams. But today, it was their only chance at survival. Mera hesitated. You can't breathe underwater. Ethan smirked, tapping the rebreather mask attached to his belt. I'm adaptable. A loud clank echoed through the station. The Union enforcers had begun overriding the external security locks. They were out of time. Ethan grabbed Mera's hand. Let's go. Together, they dived into the unknown. The ocean swallowed them whole. As soon as they hit the water, the world became a blur of deep blues and bioluminescent glow. Ethan had never fully experienced Thalassa's deep waters before. His only exposure had been through research footage. Now, he was living it. Mera moved effortlessly, her tail propelling her forward with a grace that defied gravity. She guided him through the coral-dense trenches, her form glowing faintly as she led them deeper. Ethan, despite the pressure around him, kept up. His modified rebreather mask kept his oxygen levels stable, but he knew he had limited time before they had to resurface. Mera glanced back at him, eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. Then she froze. Ethan followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. Above them, the Union's search drones were descending into the water, their scanners sweeping across the ocean in pulsing red beams. They're tracking heat signatures, Mera whispered, the vibrations of her voice reverberating through the water. Ethan clenched his jaw. Then we give them nothing to track. Without hesitation, Mera grabbed his wrist and pulled him deeper. They dived into a hidden underwater cave system, the entrance barely wide enough for a human to fit through. Ethan had no choice but to trust her as the darkness swallowed them. Behind them, the drones passed overhead, missing them by mere meters. They had survived. For now. The hidden cave led them to a secluded air pocket, where Ethan could finally remove his rebreather and catch his breath. Mera surfaced beside him, her wet silver hair clinging to her skin, her expression unreadable. Ethan exhaled. That was close. Mera nodded, but she was still tense. They'll keep looking for me, she said quietly. They won't stop until I'm gone. Ethan studied her, this woman who had been abandoned, erased, hunted, and yet, despite everything, she had survived. And now? She wasn't alone anymore. Then we keep running, he said simply. Mera frowned. For how long? Ethan met her gaze, determined. For as long as it takes. She stared at him, longer than she ever had before. Slowly, her fingers brushed against his. A silent question, a choice. Then Mera smiled. Not a sad, bitter smile. A real one. For the first time in her life, she had someone who wouldn't leave. Someone who saw her as more than a burden. Someone who chose her. Mera took his hand, gripping it tightly. Then we go together. Ethan nodded, pulling her close as they prepared for what came next. The galaxy wanted her gone, but she was still here, and with Ethan by her side, she wasn't going anywhere.